We have already gone briefly over warrants in Chapter 7, but let us refresh our memory of warrants. A warrant is a general principle that creates a logical bridge between a particular piece of evidence and a particular claim. Simply put, the warrant is the reason why you think your claim and your evidence are relevant. Many warrants are not stated as they seem obvious. However, in complex research arguments, the warrant needs to be stated very clearly in order to convince your readers that your claim is supported by your evidence. You should re-examine the warrant to test your argument's conceptual foundations and find unreliable spots. You also need to think about whether your warrant is true under all circumstances. Overlooking unsound warrants means illogical arguments, so make sure your warrants are valid. Your readers' opinions also matter. If the audience shares your assumptions, which are your warrants, stating them may be unnecessary, but if they don't, you must state your warrants explicitly so that your evidence is not deemed irrelevant. So now we know what warrants are. Then, what do warrants look like? A warrant can be phrased in several ways, but it is important that it satisfies these three criteria. One part must describe the general kind of evidence you offer. The other part must describe the general kind of claim that follows from this evidence. It must state or imply a connection between them. A way to phrase warrants is, whenever we have evidence like X, we can make a claim like Y. And we can shorten this to, whenever X, Y. Even if you leave most of your warrants unstated, it is useful to state the most important ones, at least to yourself, in order to test the conceptual foundations of your argument. As we've said before, it may help you to find the unreliable spots in your argument before your readers do. As we have covered, readers may reject your argument if they don't accept your warrant. This may happen if your warrant is false, unclear, inappropriate, or inapplicable. Let's first look at the false warrant. This is when the warrant is wrong, which means the evidence and claim don't seem connected. For example, Rinzi wants shoes and is trying to convince her mom Zilla that she should get one. Rinzi says, "Everybody else has new shoes, I need some too." But Zilla says, "If everyone jumped off the cliff, would you?" Zilla rejects Rinzi's argument, because Rinzi's warrant, which assumes that when everyone else gets something new, you should too, is wrong. Like you test whether a claim is true, you should also test that a warrant is true. Most warrants are basically just claims from more general arguments, and need their own supporting evidence, just as a bit of evidence is a claim that needs its own support. You can test the power of a warrant by looking at wider and narrower versions of it. A warrant that is too general might be hard for readers to accept, because there may be too many counterexamples and exceptions to it. One that is too narrow might be judged to be inviting an obvious question. This may happen if the evidence side of the warrant is virtually the same as the evidence offered to support the claim. Use words like always, everywhere, invariably to test the truth of your warrant. Using strong words like those in your warrant might help you realize which qualifications you might have to add to your warrant, as well as any additional research you should do to help support your warrant. Secondly, let's look at the unclear warrant. This is when the connection between the evidence and claim is unclear. For example, Rinzi says, "Look at this ad," but Zilla just says, "So?" Zilla doesn't see what the ad has to do with buying shoes for Rinzi, because the warrant is unclear. This has happened because Rinzi has skipped some arguments. The ad shows shoes, Rinzi likes the ad. She wants Zilla to buy her the shoes in the ad, so she tells Zilla to look at the ad. But all she actually tells Zilla is to look at the ad, so Zilla doesn't understand her argument. You have to make sure that your warrant is clear. If your warrant is unclear, you may end up offering evidence that you think relates to your claim, while your readers might not understand its relevance. This might happen when you take warrants for granted or when you skip through several connected arguments. You should look closely at these steps of your argument to make sure you haven't skipped any steps. Thirdly, let's look at the inappropriate warrant. This is when the warrant is the wrong kind for the argument at hand. For example, Rinzi says, "You have enough money," and Zilla says, "Forget it." Here, Rinzi's warrant, that whenever Zilla can afford to buy Rinzi something, Zilla should, is inappropriate. Sometimes, a warrant can be true for both you and your reader, yet the reader rejects your argument because the warrant is inappropriate to that reader's research practices. This can happen when your warrants are appropriate in your own community, but not in another. You cannot assume that a warrant accepted in your community will be accepted by another, as different research communities are defined partly by their different warrants. In this case, not only will the reader reject your warrant, they will also reject your evidence and think it to be strange, though not false. For example, a student studying literature may argue about a poem that The sounds of the first stanza reinforce the idea of quiet, comforting woods because most of the vowels are lower back and most of the consonants are soft and voiced. The warrant accepted in literature is that when we hear soft, dark sounds, we associate them with soft, dark images. But this kind of warrant is not accepted by other researchers in other fields. For example, a historian might want to claim that in the 1952 presidential election, voters liked Dwight Eisenhower because they saw him as a father figure. She would not say, "The sound of the Eisenhower slogan, 'I like Ike,' subliminally comforted voters." The sound of I is embraced in the sound of Ike, and both nestle in the sound of like, thereby doubly embracing the I in the father's comforting love. As historians do not accept the same kinds of warrants as do students of literature. A beginning researcher should learn and understand which warrants go with which fields, and therefore which ones your readers will accept. This will come with experience. Lastly, let's look at the inapplicable warrant. This is when the warrant does not validly admit the evidence. For example, Rinzi says, "You must not love me," and Zilla responds, "Ridiculous." Here, Rinzi's warrant is inapplicable. The implied evidence that Zilla isn't buying Rinzi's shoes is true, and we can assume that Rinzi's warrant that parents who don't love their children don't buy them shoes is true. But Rinzi's claim that Zilla doesn't love Rinzi just because Zilla isn't buying Rinzi shoes is unwarranted. The warrant might be true, but it is inapplicable. How does a warrant connect evidence to a claim validly? Unreliable evidence can be corrected, but if your argument is unwarranted, you have to fix it in a way that alters its logical structure. This is especially important in good research because the quality of reasoning that gets you to your conclusions is also part of your research and argument. How can you test whether your warrant may be inapplicable? There are 3 steps. Step 1. Infer the warrant and state it in 2 parts, in the form of whenever X, Y. Step 2. Align the evidence from the argument under the evidence side of the warrant and the claim under the claim side. Step 3. Determine whether the evidence offered is the kind admitted by the warrant and whether the specific claim is the kind it allows. The major terms in the evidence should match those in the warrant but be more specific. If the evidence and claim seem to match the corresponding parts of the warrant, you can conclude that your warrant is valid. The warrant should be a more general version of the argument. For example, this is a flawed argument. When children are exposed to images of violence, they are influenced for the worse. All our data indicate that violence among children is rising faster than in any other age group. Television violence is one of the most destructive influences on our children today. Step 1. We infer the warrant and state it in 2 parts. In this argument, the warrant is, when children constantly see images of violence, those children will be influenced for the worse. Step 2. We align the evidence under the evidence side of the warrant and the claim under the claim side. The part highlighted yellow is the evidence, and the part highlighted orange is the claim. So we align them like this. The evidence and claim should match the corresponding parts of the warrant, but they don't in this argument. The evidence side of the warrant is that children constantly see images of violence, but the evidence in the argument says that violence among children is rising the fastest. They don't match. The warrant should be a more general version of the argument on the evidence and claim sides, but children seeing violence and violence among children rising don't correspond. So here, the evidence and claim don't match the kind of evidence and the kind of claim allowed by the warrant. To fix this argument, we first make the evidence fit the warrant, then restate the claim. So we change the warrant to be, when a medium such as television constantly exposes children to images of violence, it influences them for the worse. The evidence remains the same. Now we restate the claim. As television is a major source of children's images of violence, it must be a major cause of that violence. And now the warrant admits the evidence and claim. Remember that readers may not agree with your warrant. Even if your argument is sound, you will have to anticipate that your readers might debate your points. Ask yourself what kind of evidence and warrant it will take to convince your readers. Test your most important arguments from your reader's point of view. And that's the end of Chapter 9. The next chapter will discuss qualifications in further detail.